Matthew Shepard and the Wyoming 14. I think that Wyoming needs to take some progressive steps that are kind of found in the Endow report as well, and make this state more attractive to not only business, but I think people needs to feel safe here. And Wyoming's legacy in this issue is on the wrong direction, and so I would definitely sponsor or support bills that were to protect people that are at risk.
Mr. Lindsay.
Just for clarification, can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So what decision that's been made by the legislature over the past few years would you like to revisit? Either something that they did consider and rejected, or something that they passed and ultimately that you would like to see rolled back?
Okay, well, that's pretty easy, actually. The cuts in the education budget. I think everybody who heard my opening statement probably heard that coming and saw it coming. And if you want to see evidence for why I think that was such a bad decision, all you have to do is go to any of the schools in my district or anywhere around Cheyenne. And it is my belief that education feeds into everything else. If we have a well-educated population, they will understand the need for a non-discrimination law. If they will understand the dangers of putting all your eggs in one basket economically, and they won't tolerate it. They won't tolerate it from their state legislature. Ultimately, it's the citizens who are responsible they are responsible for what the state legislature does, because they are the ones who elect them. And so a well-educated citizenry is always the best shield for any problem.
Great. And just as a follow-up, 30 seconds, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but how would you propose to reinstate that money? What funding resources would you have used to fill that gap?
Well, at the time that those budget cuts were being considered, and ultimately the Senate proposed a very high number, the House kicked back a rather low number, and they met in the middle. At first I would have looked at the LSRA and realized there was $1.8 billion in there, and I would have used some of that money to cover the shortfalls in the education budget, and then I would have restructured the payouts from the, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make this clicking noise on the microphone, I'm still learning this thing, to make sure that the funding from the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and other areas worked together to make sure that the education budget was solvent.
And Mr. Guthrie, did you have anything to add?
It wouldn't cost us a nickel to pass a non-discrimination law.
Right. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk recently, especially after the primary, about changes in party affiliation. Recent numbers suggest that more than 12,500 Wyoming voters changed their party affiliations during the primary election this summer. Do you agree with the following statement? Wyoming residents who are eligible to vote should be able to register and/or change their party affiliation on Election Day. And I believe we're starting with Mr. Lindsay.
That seems fair. And thanks for the softball question, by the way. The problem with this is that a lot of people were upset with the outcome, so they wanted to change the rule. The rule that you can switch party affiliation on Election Day has been in place in Wyoming my entire life living here. So if someone has a problem with that, they need to address it before we have an election. They don't need to wait until the election, decide they don't like it, and then want to go back and change the rule. This happens in college football every year. Somebody says, well, we were left out. Well, we all agreed on the rules. We all followed the rules, and we got the result we got. So if that needs to be changed, we need to come up with a much better reason than some people didn't like the results of the primary. And also keep this in mind, this was pointed out by several of the candidates running for governor in the last debate. Wyoming does not have to submit to federal regulation of our elections because we have same-day voter registration, and same-day voter registration is something that protects the rights of Wyoming citizens, and I will always stand for that.
Great. Mr. Guthrie.
I completely support laws that make it easy for people to vote for the candidate that they want to vote for. I think there's a guarantee of a freedom of association in the Constitution. and that laws that sort of are designed to restrict an individual's ability to vote either through this sort of thing or through having to present a physical address on a reservation or being unrolled as a voter in Georgia, all these things seem like steps backwards to me, and just letting people vote in a way that makes sense for them is a great thing that Wyoming does, and let's not undo something great.
Right. Anything to add?
Nope.
Okay. A recent University of Wyoming survey suggests that the majority of residents would support marijuana legalization for medicinal use, and nearly half support full legalization. Where do you stand on making marijuana legal, either for medicinal or recreational use, or both? We're starting with Mr. Guthrie.
Well, I'm running specifically on a campaign promise to support legislation that would legalize marijuana on any level. I mean, there's just so many reasons. In terms of my experience in working as a public defender or as a lawyer working in the court system and the absolute injustice that I see happen to people almost on a daily basis over this topic. People go to jail for 45 days in this county for possession of marijuana, lose their jobs, lose their homes. I mean, I've just seen the horror of it all. It's just completely hypocritical to me that a substance like alcohol, which is so powerful and so strong, is legal, and something like marijuana, relatively speaking, carries such harsh penalties. The state is missing out in terms of money and revenue. I think that the revenue from that alone would have taken care of the budget loss on the education issue. And lastly, I think it's the kind of policy that we need to address in terms of what's in that Endow report we've talked about, which is making Wyoming a little bit more palatable to the rest of the United States, and maybe to our kids as well. So I support it. I understand that it's controversial, and I understand it doesn't come without it comes with consequences. We're really missing the boat. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Lindsay.
Timekeeper, I apologize. I am going to go over on this one. This is where my my expertise as a nurse comes out in me. First, I'll take on medical, but a good doctor is not going to write you a prescription to smoke marijuana unless you're terminally ill. That's for two reasons. One, it's incredibly bad for your lungs, and in healthcare we have an acronym called ABC: airway, breathing, circulation. Anything that interferes with one of those three is generally not a good thing to have your patients taking, and marijuana interferes with all three. Now, there are components of marijuana that can be ingested other ways safely and do have great benefits, such as THC oil. THC oil and CBD has shown to have great benefits for people who have seizures and other chronic pain conditions and so on. And now, as far as the recreational side, there's a differentiation here that needs to be made between decriminalization and legalization. If we legalize it, that means we have to invest our resources in the Department of Health and other areas to regulate it. As a small state, population-wise, we won't make that money back. However, if we decriminalize it, then what we do is we take the burden of that away from law enforcement, and they can focus on what their job really is, which is preventing people from doing harm to other people. Did I get that out, really? Are you kidding me? I got some time left over. I had no idea.
1 second.
I didn't think that was going to work.
Anything to add or push back on?
I'll just disagree that I think that there's probably somewhere between $10 and $20 million that could be made based upon sort of, if you look at the taxation of alcohol in Colorado, the taxation of alcohol in Wyoming, and I think the taxation of alcohol in Wyoming is a little less than the taxation of alcohol in Colorado, and I think that we could definitely raise somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $20 million a year through the sale of recreational marijuana in Wyoming, and that is not an insignificant amount of money.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add that As someone who works in the Laramie County Jail, I have seen people jailed exclusively for possession of marijuana. Unfortunately, our county, and this is where we'll agree, our county and our state spends a vast amount of resources trying to police this, and we could use that money elsewhere. Maybe, I don't know, education.
Great. Okay. So let's see. Can't read my own handwriting. Okay. During shorter budget sessions, there's limited time for lawmakers to consider non-budget bills. Despite those constraints, dozens and sometimes even hundreds of bills are filed, many of which arguably, I suppose, wouldn't address a pressing legal issue. Given the limited resources, the LSO, and limited time to consider potential legislation, would you support capping the number of bills that each lawmaker is allowed to sponsor in any given year? And I guess we start with Mr. Lindsay.
Okay. I lost the order, too. I'm glad you're keeping track. Yes, I would. And the reason for that is it's called a budget session for a reason. The budget is hugely important. And when just so everyone's clear on the rules, you have to, in order for a non-budget bill to be introduced and given over to a committee in a budget session, it has to achieve 2/3 majority for introduction. And so that's how they try to keep some of those other non-budgetary items out. But a lot of them still get in. If we're going to have a budget session, let's deal with the budget first. One idea for that I've heard, and I would have to look and see how this would work, is the legislature spends 2 weeks on nothing but the budget. I don't care if something gets 3/3 majority vote in either house. We deal with the budget. Then we'll deal with these other issues if we have time. And so, yes, I would support that, and I would also support capping the amount of bills that a legislator is allowed to sponsor in a given year.
Great. Mr. Guthrie.
Well, my initial impression is it sounds like a pretty good idea, and the reason I feel like it might be a pretty good idea in terms of I think the question was limiting the number of bills that a particular legislator could introduce or I think that's about sort of equality and fairness. And if you sort of limit the number of bills maybe one person can introduce, they don't get to monopolize all the time, and so that everybody gets a chance to try to introduce something. So I think making the process fair and open and that everybody get a chance to participate makes some sense to me.
Right.
And also the things that Ryan said in terms of the importance of the issues at hand, I think, are important as well.
Right. And I forgot to mention this for the folks in the audience. Please feel free to flag someone down, and if you have a question that you would like to ask, we do have a little bit of extra time, so I would be happy to ask it. So just put up a hand, and we'll bring you a card to write something down.
Lady in the blue had a question, maybe.
No, but I have a lot of comments, but I'm going to wait until after.
Okay. Oh, sorry then. Sorry.
Great. Well, one of the issues that has come up is the issue of Wyoming's prisons and the number of people who are incarcerated in this state. They've launched a reinvestment effort to try to figure out and analyze some data to figure out who those people are and what the state might be able to do to fix some of those problems. But where do you stand on Wyoming's need for criminal justice reform? And I know that's a very broad question, but are there areas of the criminal justice system that you think deserve some editing or revision to maybe keep people out of prison, if that's something you agree with? I think it's Mr. Guthrie's turn.
Sure. Wow, I've got some ideas on this one. It's just crazy. All over the state, you can get, in one county, you can get probation on something, and in another county, it's 10 years in prison. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we need sentencing guidelines, but I think maybe we need some sort of maybe revisiting what's important. I don't mean to just harp on marijuana, but I will for just a second. It's just shocking to me that selling an ounce of marijuana will get you more time than hitting my wife. Our criminal code is all over the place in terms of what it treats seriously and what it doesn't treat seriously. Our criminal code as it treats juveniles it's it's unfair. The state really needs to take a look at its criminal code and decide what's important, what people need to be incarcerated for, and what they don't. I think it costs upwards of $50,000 a year to incarcerate a person. I had a client who wrote a $17 check for pizza go to prison for several years. Admittedly, it wasn't his account, so it was forgery, but it was a $17 check for pizza. That's the problem we have. There are violent, terrible people that need to be in prison, and then there's the rest of everybody else. The United States has a problem incarcerating 25% of the people on the planet in prisons, and we can address it locally here.
Right. And just a quick follow-up question to that, if you don't mind, Mr. Lindsay.
Oh, yeah.
And Mr. Guthrie, but I was going to ask it anyway. So,
I'm in charge.
I guess when you say maybe revisiting, how would you codify that in statute? I guess would there be an agreement? Would you adjust the sentencing maximums? How exactly would you prioritize those different crimes?
Right. I think you need to put everything on the table, and probably in some sort of committee fashion, and kind of look at the thing as an overall problem. Maybe look at the model code for some advice. You know, Wyoming's a very small state, so in terms of our jurisprudence from the Supreme Court, it's very limited. So we have to look everywhere else for sort of like, well, how do we deal with all these issues? And so maybe look to the model code, look and find out what's important to Wyoming people. And like I said, I think hitting my wife's more important than selling something. So I would make some changes there.
Right. Okay, Mr. Lindsay, for the underlying question. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, one of the large reasons for the growth in the prison population, unfortunately, are two of the healthcare crises that we have right now. One is methamphetamines, and then the other one is the opioid crisis. These are huge problems that have to be dealt with, but we aren't going to deal with them specifically and effectively through incarceration. All the data shows it doesn't work. And I'm a nurse. I don't do what doesn't work. I just don't. I don't like spinning my wheels. But I'll tell you that I think the best way for us to revise these guidelines and help bring Wyoming's prison population down so that the only people who are in there are people who need to be there because they have either done harm to somebody else or they've done great harm to the state or their communities. And that is to bring together the attorneys, bring together the law enforcement agencies, and don't just bring the top people. Bring the people who are actually on the street doing the work and bring them all in and put them in an environment where they know they can communicate without fear of reproach. And you will be shocked at what you hear, and I think that we can revise the criminal code that way, and we will walk away with a much better society in which to live.
Right. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
This is kind of related to that, and I'm not really sure how much control the state legislature has over this, but I am personally appalled and disgusted and shocked and dismayed at the number of children that are being taken and put in prisons around this country. I know this because in Florida, where I am currently living, there are a number of prisons, for-profit prisons in the state of Florida that have hundreds of children who were taken away from their parents at the border, and I personally would like to know what the state legislature can do to prevent that kind of thing happening here.
Are you specifically talking about immigration or juvenile?
Children that are taken, that are created
Okay.
as orphans
Okay.
by being separated at our border.
Do you folks, I guess, think that the state legislature has a role in policing immigration at a statewide level and specifically in regard to children? I believe that's what the question was. Wonderful. Let's start with Mr. Lindsay.
Okay, well, I share your concern about for-profit prisons, and anyone who's done any research on this will share your concern as well. There are certain things that shouldn't be profit-making ventures, and incarceration is one of them. And I would urge my fellow legislators, if I am fortunate enough to join